really just kind of was sitting here during this pandemic and I was like, I'm not doing music. Let me try to figure other ways to keep myself busy, to keep myself thinking, to experience new things. And I was kind of like, I would love to work and learn some survival techniques, especially since we're in this like pandemic where we're like everything, you never know what's going on. So I was kind of like, what if I kind of learned how to approach something from the mentality of like, what if I need this for some reason, you know? So farms are actually you actually need experience, you would think, one would think, to work on like your average farm. So I started working on a berry farm, and that was kind of an easy way to get into it because all I had to do was like harvest things, I just had to pick berries originally. But then after a while I was kind of like, I want to learn other things. So I started doing beekeeping. I started learning how like tractors work. Like it really became sort of this kind of thing where I was like, this is a lifestyle, you can't really just hop into it and hop out of it as easy as one would think, as easy as I thought, at least. So that's kind of how it started. And now I just have these skills. I can tell you when blackberries grow, it's like, well, if it ever comes down to it.
What's the process there? You just like, is there a, I don't know, is there like a Craigslist for farming?
Honestly, so the one I work on is this farm that is mainly berries and fruits and things. So we pretty much just plant during the winter seasons because everything starts to die out, and then we have a little bit of a break from the first month or so of the year after we do a bunch of plant care, trimming the primocane and floricane and all of that kind of stuff and getting everything set up. And then it's more plant care after that until about April and May when we start doing strawberries and stuff.
What's the process of you going from like, hey, the apocalypse or whatever is happening, I want to work on a farm? Like, how do you actually get a job on a farm in 2020?
Honestly, I was just with a friend that was like, "Hey, I work on a farm and I've been there for a minute." And I was like, "Cool, that sounds awesome." They were like, "The ad is on Craigslist. Check it out." And I was like, "All right, I guess most people don't really see those kind of ads. Where would you put that kind of ad? You know what I mean?" So
It actually was on Craigslist.
yeah, there was actually something on Craigslist. Yeah, but they had already been there for about a year and some change, so they cleared it up, and I was like, "Cool, let's start this."
And you didn't like grow up on or around a farm or
Not
doing
at
any of
all.
that?
Not at all. No, no, no.
And you're just like, I want to do some manual labor. I want to like get out there in
Yeah.
the field and like really like use my hands and probably I assume have an aching back at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was definitely something where I was like, I'm used to kind of orchestrating and conducting when it comes to my music. So any kind of thing to pull me away from that's not musically is actually pretty fun, I think, in a lot of ways, especially where it's like, oh, on the farm, I'm just somebody picking berries with a bunch of other people, and I could listen to music all day and not say anything the whole day if I want, or I could talk to everybody around me. I feel like even kind of dictating how I maneuver in those little ways is kind of enough for me to be like, this is cool. I don't know. I like learning things.
You could do music or talk to people. What did you find yourself doing most days?
Talking to people. I love also learning how people talk, and it's definitely a different community than the one that I'm used to that works on a farm. So it was cool. I definitely have good experiences where I just kind of listen a lot.
So I'm from California originally, and like obviously, a ton of agriculture out there, and the people doing most of the work in the fields, it's largely like migrant work from like Mexico, as you would expect. Is it similar on the East Coast?
Yeah, so there is a program where people from Mexico do come over and they have certain parameters and they work certain hours. But since we're so far from that community, at least geographically, there's not too many. And I think also there is sort of more of a sort of strictness because we're not so close to that area comparatively.
You said there were most of the people you're dealing with were from like different walks of life, but were there other people who were in a similar boat as you who like were perhaps pursuing something more creative, but were doing this as kind of a day job?
There were people that were like-minded like me, but there wasn't really anybody like me. Like there was definitely people who pursued it to just prolong another avenue of like money making that they could. But I think that my main issue was the main thing. It'd be like the worst thing that would be if someone come up to me and be like, "Oh, it looks like you're made for this" or something. It's like there's nobody else on the farm that's gonna hit like it's gonna hit me. It's just one of those things. So
If they like said you're really
Oh,
good at this, you'll take
yeah,
that almost as an insult.
Yeah, be like, it's like that's a little like a little weird, I'm just picking berries. I'm not doing anything too anything too creative right now. It's kind of funny. It's definitely depends on the day, but there was definitely other people that were creative.
It's not creative necessarily, but I'm sure like every other job in the world, it's something that takes skill, and that's something that like some people are probably more attuned to, or just generally better
Definitely.
at, maybe more efficient at than other people.
Definitely. Yeah. 100%.
I mean, you alluded to this a little bit, but was it a chance to kind of get out of your head a little bit?
It was actually the exact opposite. Like that, all that time, I just spent so much time in my head that I eventually became kind of comfortable with myself in a lot of ways. And I think
Hmm.
it made me more confident in how I talk about myself now. It definitely was like, oh, I'll be out on the farm for 8 hours and I'll just be thinking of everything I've ever done. And then it's like, I forget it and I just do it again the next day, but I have a little bit of what I thought from previous days. So it was kind of cool to be able to think so much about so many things uninterrupted because now I'm kind of cool with talking about so many things.
What does that mean that you weren't comfortable talking about yourself? I mean, you said, I think before we started recording, you had said earlier that you hadn't really done a ton of interviews up to this point.
I stopped listening to my own music for a while and stopped kind of making music for a while because there was definitely moments when I would listen to my album and I would be like, this is so good, this needs to be released, and then be like, it's not the time yet, and then I would just sit and listen to it for several hours. And it's like, that's a lot of time to be sitting and listening to yourself talk and not thinking about yourself. I would just listen. I wouldn't be thinking. I'd be like, this sounds really good, what if I did this, that, and the third? But out on the farm, it was kind of like I could think about myself and listen to myself at the same time and not have to sort of compete with what I'm hearing and trying to nitpick and kind of use that to cover up that I'm trying to think about myself in different ways and different lights and learn a little bit, and be comfortable with myself.
What do you mean by it not being the time to be released?
I've been making this record for, I mean, several years now, and there's definitely moments where I was like, this is the track list. This is what I think it is. This is exactly how it should go. And it wasn't, it's like, I theoretically could have had this record done in 2018, and it's like, it would have not had three or so songs on it, but I still would have been proud of it. But it just felt like I hadn't finished the chapter of learning that kind of came with this life. The pandemic sort of started, and it definitely felt like that was a good time to finish that learning in that kind of area of growth that came with making an album that's lasted since like 2018, 2017. I felt kind of that could round it off this whole time period.
What were those learnings? What were those last few learnings that you needed in order to finish this thing?
I really wanted to think about how somebody in my position as a black man and their proximity to harm, and I really wanted to kind of learn about how there are cycles and there's community and there's therapy, and I wanted to kind of dabble in that a little bit and just see how can someone like me evaluate how I maneuver in the world and maneuver a little bit better. And I think taking the time that I would spend listening to my music for 3 hours, I could be, maybe reading or maybe even just sitting quietly and just like writing. So did a lot of that, which was definitely beneficial.
Did you say proximity to harm? Was that the phrase you used?
Yeah, definitely.
What does that mean?
I think that there was definitely a lot of things that I thought that I knew. I always you think once you hit a certain, I've like this fear of once I hit like 26 or whatever that I'm gonna think I know everything, and it's like actuality that's not true at all, and there's just constant learning. And I think with my records, there's definitely a lot of me trying to think that I know what I'm talking about, sounding like I know what I'm talking about, that confidence. But with this last album, there was definitely a lot of vulnerability that came with that sort of, I know what I'm talking about. I think that is sort of like, I don't know. That's just how I was thinking about it.
There's definitely a legacy in hip hop. I guess, in rock too. I'm probably going all the way back to the blues of people really exerting a lot of confidence.
Yeah,
Like
definitely.
specifically in a lot of commercial hip hop, there is a lot of bragging. Is that something that you felt like you wanted to push back against?
I think that I wanted to do it with more intention. I love when people can do that well. I think when people can do it well, it definitely adds to the story. I think there's great storytellers, but there are people that can also use humor to deflect and to draw in and to talk about how serious in nature it is. And I think when you lean too much into one area, you can be very good at being braggadocious. You can be very good at storytelling. But if you can do both, if you can still put humor to match the certain trauma that you're talking about, then it sort of becomes this beautiful sort of dark comedy that is the Black experience in a lot of ways through hip hop. And I really think that it's hard to make that balance, but being more vulnerable.
It's a funny thing, like specifically in hip hop that I've noticed, because it's like Jay Z saying, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman." Like that's earned,
Yeah.
right? Like by the time he got to a point where he could say something like that, like he had obviously like amassed this empire. But because it is such a foundational, oh, cliche is the right word, but such a foundational element of hip hop generally, like you hear these guys and gals who are like 18 putting out their first record and rapping like they're moguls. There's a disconnect
Yeah.
there, right? There's a disconnect of having that kind of energy when you're really putting your first record out into the world. Maybe it's overcompensating.
Definitely. I think it is overcompensating. I think it's hard to know your story immediately. And I think we should allow space for people who don't know their story immediately to figure it out, you know?
Did you ever worry that you were overthinking it though? I mean, the amount of time that it took to sort of get this record out there. At a certain point when you're making something, it is sort of important to set it free and just let it exist in the world.
Definitely. Yeah, I didn't think that I was overthinking it too much. I knew that there was certain things that I wanted to add. Like the last song I wrote for the album was probably done in 2020 and it was Protective Styles. I don't remember which one it is on the tape, but it definitely came out of me doing trial and error with songs that I've already made, putting them on this tape, then being like, this actually doesn't fit and to say what I want to say and taking them off. So I feel like once I kind of rounded it out with sort of the latter half of the album being more vulnerable than the first half, it was like this is the perfect amount of time.
Does that mean that when you're sequencing the thing that there's a broader arc across the tracks?
Definitely, yeah. So with the first, I read that Shinichiro Watanabe, the guy who did Cowboy Bebop, wrote Cowboy
Mhm.
Bebop, the first episode and the last episode first in 1998 because I want to say Bandai was the toy company that wanted to that licensed and bought the rights to Cowboy Bebop, but since Star Trek was so popular, they wanted him to make a space show that would go on forever. And he was like, the way to combat that is let me write the first and the last episode and kind of figure it out right now. So write the ending first. So it kind of became this thing for me that I was like, that's really cool. I mean, I also love that show. And I think that it is a great idea to allow yourself to kind of know when it is an ending. So I wrote the first and the last song first, Chain So Heavy and Twist My Hair. And those songs were kind of like, okay, this is the beginning. Chain So Heavy is really chaotic, really a lot. It's like very heavily jazz, and then Twist My Hair is more laid back, no drums, more R&B. So I was like, how do I get from point A to point B? And I think that because Chain So Heavy came before the Chain So Heavy came before I sort of like my friend died and that kind of changed how the album went. So as it goes, Chain So Heavy, Never Will Know, Bless the Child, and then Make a Poet Black, I think is around the time that I lost my friend, and that kind of culminates at that moment, you know what I mean? And then because of that, it goes into Swangin' and then Protective Styles, or I think that's the order. So Protective Styles is more of kind of like this redemption and me kind of thinking like what was needed for this situation, for this relationship, for this person. It's like more therapy, more access to things like that, maybe like all of these questions I had. And then it goes into Swangin', I think, which is like the song that is like, all right, well now we're back at it, but we're not fully there. We're having a good time, but we don't really know. We're kind of covering up what is going on, mentally. And then it goes into the latter half of the album, which includes songs like Mama's Home, Grown Man Voice, BBNE, and I think that's it. And then Twist My Hair. And I think those songs kind of showed like the coming down of all of these events. You know what I mean? BBNE kind of is like this sort of turn near the end of the album where it's like now it's more serious, and then Mama's Home is sort of this thing where it's like, okay, we have to go back to the beginning to sort of see where we made mistakes, and then Twist My Hair is sort of this is the end, but is it the end? Question mark.
The Cowboy Bebop thing is really interesting. The closest analogy that I can come up with off the top of my head is, did you ever read Bone, the comic Bone by
Oh,
Jeff
I
Smith?
love Bone. Yeah.
He came up with the characters when he was like a small child, doodled them, and he always said that he knew what the last page was.
Awesome. That's so sick. I love Bones.
Obviously, it like took him 1,000 pages to get there. It's interesting to create an entire work, sort of knowing, almost kind of racing to the finish line. It sounds like.
Definitely. That's so cool that you interviewed Jeff Smith. Bones is so cool. But yeah, it definitely gives you sort of an ending in sight. And I think it kind of forces you to be okay with whatever happens, and not be worried about the mistakes that you've made creating it, because those ultimately, if you do it correctly, should have go back into how you then finish this thing.
So, how much of that broader narrative that you just described to me, is it a picture that you figured out once all the songs were there in place? I'm almost like picturing you on like a cop show with all the cork boards and the wires and everything else, like
Yeah.
trying to like connect all of these pieces. How intentional is that storyline that you just gave me?
Honestly, it's kind of wild. It's like it's wild and it's messed up and it's humorous, but I started writing the story a long time ago, and it's the first two albums revolved around a certain event that happened, a fictional event that happened in a neighborhood that then sort of placated this character to kind of dive deeper into all of his experiences, aka me figuring out black masculinity issues and then figuring out black queer issues, black women issues, adding trans people into there, sort of this whole thing. And then,
I should add in for the listener before we go any further that we're pulling back the camera a little bit more,
oh
and
yeah,
this is the third of a trilogy.
yeah. The first one is Who Taught You to Hate Yourself in 2016, and the second one is The Importance of Self Belief in 2018.
We discussed specifically the arc of the last album.
Mm-hmm.
What is the broader arc on top of that of the three?
They kind of detail my life as I'm learning. That's, I think, a self insert is kind of what most artists do. But I think that with the first one, Who Taught You to Hate Yourself, sort of was me. I started writing that around 2014. So it's kind of me coming into this sort of like, oh, black issues, they should be more present in my ideas and my thinking and my praxis. But I was really kind of only leaning towards black masculinity, which is definitely something to fight for, but I didn't really know the full picture. So with The Importance of Self-Belief kind of came this thing where I was like, okay. And it kind of also goes with it sonically too. Who Taught You to Hate Yourself is mainly beats, mainly beats and me paying homage to a lot of older rappers that I knew, like Sean Price, Guilty Simpson, Planet Asia, I think, and a lot of people. And it's like a lot of men on there, and that sort of mind. And it came this sort of thing where it's like I was proud of it, but you can hear sonically my growth. So then Importance of Self-Belief was one where I was like, black men are not the end all be all. That one was started kind of in like 2016 to 2018, I think, when that came out. And it was sort of thing where it was like black women are actually the backbone of blackness, and became this sort of thing where that's why there's like the song God's Land too, which is the poem by Maya Pittman. And there's a lot of empty endings on songs where it's just vocals by Doe Eyes and my friend Jalen, and they sort of like are to reflect that at the end of these chaotic experimental songs that I'm working with jazz and trying to figure it out, there is still somebody back home that is the actual getting the brunt of all of this story. There's a figure back home, a person back home, and it usually tends to be black women. So with For My Mama and Anyone Who Looked Like Her, it became the sort of thing where it's like, okay, now here I am, 2017 to 2020, 2021, honestly, and it's like now I know that there's so much more to blackness, including queerness, black trans people. You know what I mean? Now this community I'm in is like so much bigger than me. And it became this sort of thing where it was like, all right, this album is for my mama and anyone who looked like her. And it's really exactly what you think it is. Experiences that I have accumulated over my whole life, but mainly in the last couple of years with these new people that I now love, and how we are all working towards liberation in that sort of way.
I think you might be the first person I talked to who is like really as in love with that Random Acts record as I was.
Oh yeah,
Which
random,
I don't know why,
ridiculous.
because I feel like you might have mentioned Black Milk in an interview at some point
Yes,
too.
I love Black Milk.
I don't know why that record has just not gotten the love it deserved, but I think it's like one of the all time great
It's
hip hop records.
incredible. Like, and honestly, Black Milk doesn't get the love he deserves. Like, I don't really have records like vinyls, but Black Milk's There's a Hell Below is like one of the only vinyls I have, like for real. And
Album of the year was fantastic
yes,
too. Yeah.
yes, he is just so underrated. And then nobody talks about him, and it's kind of messed up because that Random Acts record, Guilty Simpson, just like holding it down with like, he's the one that kind of is, you get what you expect and he does it so well. And then you got Black Milk, incredible on the production, giving you beats that this rapper Guilty Simpson will never be over. And then you have Sean Price, who's just like rapping, just saying
Just
whatever
like
comes
probably
to
one
his
of the last
mind.
Sean Price records too, right?
Yes, yeah. I think that was the one released before Imperious Rex. I think Imperious Rex was the post album.
I do want to get back to the idea of representation and identity, and it's super interesting to me from the standpoint of obviously my grappling with this and your grappling with this are coming from different places, But I, as a cis white guy, who recognizes that they're important stories to tell, but also running up against the question of, are they my stories to tell? And, can I possibly do these stories justice? And when you're talking about broadening your own horizons and telling those stories on record, specifically in the case of, I mean, I don't know what your orientation is, but, is specifically in the case of like queer people or trans people or women, how are you able to tell those stories, and how important is it to involve those people in the creation of the record and the creation of the music in order to have them tell their own stories?
It's a huge part. It's hard because I definitely had a lot of my thinking of the last year also came with imposter syndrome, because there was a lot of moments where this album where I talk mainly about my friend, but my friend has passed, and it's like, are these moments mine to even talk about? Who is there to corroborate these stories? If I am the only one that remembers them when I'm gone, will anybody remember them? Why am all of a sudden am I a poet now because I lost somebody? And it's like a lot of things kind of circled in my mind, and it became this thing where I was like, well, if I relate all of these stories to how I interact with them and still have the people that are influencing me as my backbone and involved in this, it becomes something where I'm not sort of going too far in. I don't overtly start talking about things I don't really know about, but I will say like this line of stop killing trans people, or something about how I put a whole poem about how this doesn't revolve around me, it's a bigger thing. It's like, if you're doing the work and if you have the people involved behind you, then you sort of just do it from the heart with your intentions. You just got to make sure that you know your intentions when you do it, and having people as your backbone and having people to ask about it definitely does help when you're trying to figure out your own identity. It's always good to have references.
From what I've heard of the new record and your music and what I've seen in videos, it's largely you and live instrumentation performing over that music. Do you think that sort of going forward, being more inclusive could or should mean actually getting those people on record?
Definitely. And I think that when you have a story that you want to tell, it can get hard kind of thinking how to approach that with bringing everybody in. It's hard to talk about your own life while trying to make sure everybody's life is properly represented on a record. And I think that there's no right way to go about it, but if you keep trying and keep your intentions correct, you'll eventually find a way to make it work for you and your community.
Imposter syndrome is interesting. I mean, obviously, it's something that, like, I think for whatever reason is kind of like in the zeitgeist these days. I feel like it is something that people are talking about in ways that they hadn't before, and it's interesting to hear it referenced in that way in terms of the stories that you're telling, because traditionally I tend to think of it as being more of a creative or professional concern as far as I'm putting out a record and comparing yourself to all of the other people who put out a record, from the standpoint of, can I really consider myself a professional musician?
Yeah.
It's another level of the vulnerability of putting yourself out there and putting yourself on record.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, honestly, with me, I don't really worry about other people's kind of stuff anymore. It's definitely, I'm very confident in how I write. And I think because I like what I write, I don't really, I mean, it's funny because I keep joking about the only thing that would derail me is if Kendrick Lamar just started dropping albums and all of a sudden people would be like, oh, there's no space for anybody else who raps over jazz. You know what I mean? Or like No Name or one of those artists that people just kind of gravitate towards when they think about one certain genre of rap music. But otherwise, I'm pretty confident in what I say, you know?
Talk about tough comparisons.
Oh,
Just,
yeah. Don't even get me
if the one person you're
started.
comparing yourself to is Kendrick, then
Don't even get me started. It's like people will hear saxophone and me rapping and they're like, "Oh, wow, so this
yeah.
is about to be To Pimp a Butterfly." And I'm like, "Do not embarrass me. Please do not embarrass me because what don't you we're going to look both like fools when someone's like this is not To Pimp a Butterfly."
Yeah, I mean, obviously the guy didn't invent rapping over jazz instrumentation. I mean,
Exactly.
that was a pretty big thing in the '90s specifically, right?
Exactly. I mean, even Black Milk, Odyssey, a lot of people do it without the same critical acclaim, but I think I think people see my vulnerability as something to measure up to that in the same way, and how I kind of will do things where if I mess up, I kind of keep it, or if somebody messes up, I kind of keep it, and I try to make it intentional and find a way to explain it. So I think a lot of people sort of and it's also hard because there definitely was a culture shift into 2015 when that record came out. People definitely were like, "Oh, so rap has another side of it that was obviously there since a long time before that album." But it became more of a thing that was possible in the mainstream that I think a lot of people and I definitely take influence from that too. But I think people think I take sonic influence from that album, where it's like, nah, that I'm Terrence Martin, Kamasi Washington, Robert Glasper. Nah. Chris Dave. No. It's like so it's hard.
I mean, at the end of the day, though, it's got to be a net positive. I mean, obviously, there's the issue of people comparing you directly to what is a masterpiece of a record by
Yeah.
by like one of the great rappers of our era. But I mean, ultimately, I think it's a net positive from the standpoint of anybody who opens people up sonically is probably beneficial to you putting a record out into the world.
I think it's hard because a lot of people who aren't black will kind of see rappers and they try to immediately put them within this sort of binary of this versus this, and it's not knowingly, but there definitely is sort of an unknown a subconscious push to being like, oh, no name is like Lauryn Hill, and it's like, well, now that means there's only room for one. You either prefer the old or you prefer the new, you know what I mean? And it's kind of this thing that happens so frequently because there's such a limited amount of, a limited amount of rappers, but a limited amount of like black women rappers, a lot. But I think a lot of people, it goes Taylor's all the time, Big Year Tupac, it's Kanye or Lil Wayne when that was happening, it kind of keeps going forever. And I think with me, I'm just worried about not even being able to live up to that potential before I even get there. So, but it's kind of stupid. I gotta get over it.
I think it's just the way people sort of process or consume art is that it is useful in approaching stuff to have it be in a box. So if somebody says like, yeah, he's like Kendrick, I mean, dude, where is a badge of honor?
Yeah, it's definitely with comparison. So there's definitely comparisons, and then there's recommended for artists you like is kind of like different than a comparison. I feel like with a comparison, there's sort of this room for one, and it's because of rap being so sort of close to the heart and in some sort of ways braggadocious, in some ways very conflicting, in some ways very very contextual and dense, be with backstory of a certain person where they come from, that it goes a little bit deeper when you're talking about two rappers, instead of like a band where it's like a general group of people, compared to being like, oh, this rapper is versus this rapper, and it's hard to figure out that language. I'm trying to figure out that language, but there is sort of more of a being close to home when you talk about two individual people with real lives. Also, I'm not in the same bracket as even Mr. Lamar, so it's like kind of whatever with that point, you know what I mean? But on other levels,
It's interesting. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a fair point in that, being in a band is like being in a small business or something, right?
yeah,
And especially if your stock and trade is putting incredibly personal stuff on record
yeah,
and
definitely,
exposing yourself like that. I think that maybe that to you is where it becomes problematic to compare yourself directly to another person.
Definitely. Struggles are completely different, especially when this record is so heavily in my own sort of overcoming and processing and this, that, and the third, whereas other rap records are also a specific person kind of overcoming, processing this, that, and the third. So it's hard to compare those two sort of stories. It's not there it is. It's not comparing the names, it's comparing the stories, and then that becomes sort of kind of weird. It's hard.
Hopefully it doesn't also mean that there's only space for one person to talk about something like Black Identity on a
Oh
record.
yeah, definitely not.
When we're talking about sort of the influences of the past year, do you get the sense that because a lot of this stuff that a lot of people have been pushing to the side is now more out in the open, that people are more willing to consume art that discusses these ideas?
Definitely. I think though it's not new not a new concept to talk about this. I think every year it sort of becomes something where it's different. And I think 2015 when To Pimp a Butterfly came out, it definitely was a moment where to the public eye it was like, oh, this genre, it's a reminder that this genre can be more vulnerable. It's not like it never wasn't, but it's a reminder that it could be more vulnerable to those that are not living this experience or similar experiences. And I think it's hard because I don't really politics don't influence my life in my music because I'm living these experiences and they just kind of happen to align with what is happening all the time. So I definitely feel like I don't know. Yeah, I think that's the end of that.
Obviously, it's not something that has ever gone away for you or for anybody else who is living those experiences. It's more of a question of, listen, I think Trump was a very bad president, but I think he
Yeah.
woke a lot of people up to
Yeah.
the fact
It-
that a lot of this shit is still that was bubbling under the surface for a long time.
yeah, there was definitely it's more out in the open now, and I think that allows for more people to figure out how they want to react to it.
Maybe it means like other people are more willing to listen to it.
Yeah,
Hopefully, right?
definitely. Yeah. So I think there's space, and I think that it all, there's space for all of that.
Getting back to imposter syndrome, I guess from a creative standpoint, you said it is something that you had moved beyond. I'm wondering when you had that realization and whether creative imposter syndrome was perhaps part of what made you wait so long to release a record out into the world.
I think I had that realization a lot while I was first making the beginning of this record, and then I had it more, not more. I had more of it when I started working in isolation on that farm, and then I also sort of not fully overcame it, but kind of accepted it more. And now I kind of allow it to happen. And I've sort of came to the point where it's like my story is so personal to me that there's no way there's anybody else's story who is like mine, even if it is the same thing in a way, generally. I shouldn't allow my audience to think that I am making something similar to someone else when in actuality, as long as it's working for me, then why not?
Certainly, you're not the first person to come across that struggle, but I mean that's just the great creative struggle generally, right? Is how to
Definitely.
do something that is both about you but also touches on things that hopefully will resonate with the listener.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I'm still making music. So it's like even if I want to talk about the most personal thing that I can, I still want to try to make a way that I can listen to it myself. I like listening to myself back. I wanted to create things that I wasn't seeing in the world, and I think that's what I'm trying to do. So even if I want to make something so dense, I should still at least make it approachable to me. And if I make it approachable to me, then it might be approachable to the people that are similar to me.
What's your sense of those things that you weren't seeing or hearing in the world?
I would really love the theatrics of music. I really love the theatrics that are in my music. I love just the strings and all of that. And I was like, what if I just push that and just have start rapping over like chamber pop stuff? I really thought there was space for that it wasn't fully taken up, and I haven't fully figured out the formula for it, but I think that I love that I'm rapping over violins and swirling strings and things, you know what I mean? And kind of reacting to the orchestra that's behind me.
When we were talking about what you majored in, I was fully expecting you to tell me it was some sort of like, I don't know, jazz or classical
Yeah,
or like some like or musical theory or something, because one, it's just difficult from the standpoint of, I don't know, I feel like there's really clear parameters if you're rapping over like a standard beat or like, a drum machine or something, right? I mean, there's a lot of
definitely.
precedent for that. Obviously, this is just jazz generally, but you're just sort of, you're freer, but it's got to be more difficult because you don't have any really clear foundation when you're creating the music.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think that the other thing that kind of puts me in a different group is that I think I leaned much more into not only the vulnerability of the lyrics, but also the vulnerability of the music. I feel people think jazz is either technical or chaotic. They don't really think about the in between, when in actuality, both of those extremes have this sort of vulnerability of either you are allowing yourself to know what comes next or you have no idea what comes next. And I felt like that would be really cool to kind of match with the lyrics that are also very much conceptually like, I don't know what comes next, or I know exactly what I'm about to do tonight, you know? So it's kind of this thing where I thought that sonically matched the story.
Do you start though in the same place, in the same way that if you were doing kind of a more traditional rap song, you would start with a beat or a drum machine? Do you start with the drummer and then kind of build the pieces up from there?
Usually I will be having an experience or a moment or a thought, and I kind of will write down what that thought is. And then once I write down what that thought is, I kind of approach it. What is the best way I could explain this? Like the most beautiful way I could say these words, like with certain rhythms and things like that. But I try to find ways that I can just push the meaning and the concept as far as I can without it being too big and too abstract. But from there, once I have enough of those experiences that are the same from different points in time, I kind of put them together into one verse. And then once I have a full verse, I'm like, okay, so this part of the verse is very calm. I'll rap it very calm. And then this part of the verse, I'll get more loud, I'll get more in your face. And then this part of the last two bars of the verse, I'll calm down again. So once I have that sort of like energy and feeling that I felt when I was writing it, I record the vocal draft, and then I sort of approach all the instruments I think I want on it. If I'm doing something in your face, I would love really heavy plucking or very loud guitar or things like that. So I'll approach the guitarist, I'll approach this, that, and the third. And then I allow everybody to sort of get to me when they can. If you let people if you send people something, you can't really expect them to send it back on your time, especially in this age where like this current period where time is so different for everybody. So I kind of allowed people to get back to me when they can. And once they get back to me, then they send something that is either like, all right, I'm in a comfortable position to record this and it's going to sound like that, or something has happened to me that I am so full of these feelings that I'm going to record something. And then it kind of comes like that. And I think that allowing people to, being patient with people and allowing them to get something whenever they feel like it also forms the energy and language and the sound of the song and the energy of it. So I think that's how I do it. I kind of get things whenever I get things. That's the downside of it. People send me things like 2 years later, but it's like, you got it. It's totally fine with me as long as had a good time recording it. I'm gonna use it. So
Did you ever play an instrument or play in a band or?
when I was younger, I played like the flute and the violin, but I guess yeah, that kind of influences how I approach the sounds of my music now that I think about it. I never really put two and two together. I kind of was just thinking that I did them, but now it makes sense that I love the theatrics of those instruments in my music.
Part of why I ask is because, you're talking about being on other people's schedules, which I totally get, which, like, again, if you were like Kendrick or whatever, and you're like, here's
Yeah, right.
$500,000 or whatever,
Exactly.
however the hell much he plays the studio. I mean, that's probably highballing it, but anyway, then people would be on your own time. But I think in the same way that you kind of have to be on other people's schedules, if you're not like a jazz virtuoso yourself, then there has to be a tremendous amount of trust in what they're doing, and
Yeah.
that you're kind of giving them, sounds like, kind of broad directions, and they have to connect all the dots.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of gives and serves for the unknowing that comes with it. You know, it's funny, my bassist that is on the songs the most, Anthony Kavanaugh, he is so, every time he hears it, he gets like so annoyed with me because he's like, I can't believe you left that mistake in there. And it's like, that mistake might be what I formed the whole verse around. Like, it's so funny with Chain So Heavy, there's a part where the drums stop and the drums like flip and everyone's like, oh wow, that's so cool, like free jazz, like chaotic. And it's like, in actuality, we forgot we was recording. Like, we just completely stopped and it was a hiccup, and we just threw it in there anyway because I thought it would sound cool to cut it right there and make all the instruments that came after that cut it right there, you know. So I see what they did with that, and I think that was cool because I didn't know what to do with it. So
When when you're doing this and you've got so many people involved, and I assume that this is probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but like, if it takes 2 years or however long for them to get it back, does that mean that you get to have that you don't really get to have a lot of back and forth, that if something like doesn't isn't quite exactly what you wanted, that you have the opportunity to sort of send it back into to workshop it a little bit?
yeah, everybody's different. Honestly, everybody's different. I could tell you how people, I can tell you like by the instruments, like usually with keyboard players I can get it back really quickly. With like flute players it takes a little bit longer, you know. So guitar players, there's so many people that play guitar, like if I really wanted to I could play, you know. So it just kind of comes down to the instrument and how much I really want it, because if I really want it, then I also really want that person to be on it, you know. I really want them to give their energy into it. So even if it's not something that I immediately had in mind, I think that people kind of get the energy of the song and they put it out as much as they can. You know, that's why you let them get comfortable. You be patient.
In 2020, the ability to actually like be in a room with a bunch of people and to jam or to kind of figure some of this stuff out in person and live was just, it wasn't really there. But do you see in the future, do you think there's an opportunity to do a little bit more of this in person, to kind of to workshop in a way that you haven't really afforded yourself before?
I love when people work from their bedrooms and like send it back to me. I mean, maybe I think working with people in person would definitely be a different energy. And I'm not gonna lie, so many people I know are like, "Oh, I love working with people in person," and I'm not really too used to it, which is funny. I should probably overcome that because life happens. I don't know. Eventually, I'm going to have to be in a room with somebody, and I'm gonna be like, "Oh, I want you to play play the ABC chord or whatever," you know. So
I saw some of the live performances online, and it does sort of give this. It has this energy to it that does feel a little bit more organic. But I think there's just, when we think of jazz, we think of it as being something that is sort of improvisational and organic in person. So it would be interesting to sort of to see if there's a way to bridge the gap between those two.
definitely, yeah. I love with my band. It kind of becomes, since we've traveled so much together, we kind of have this energy of, if we don't like it, say it right now, because if you don't, we're gonna just be playing it to the point where it doesn't sound the same after this tour, you know. And I think that improvisation plays a large role with my raps, even because I kind of like being on my toes while I'm rapping at the shows. Specifically, I kind of like being able to be like, oh, somebody messed up, but that's okay, like we just keep it moving, nobody knows.
Are you freestyling at all? Are you how good of a freestyler are you?
Oh, I'm a horrible freestyler. Actually, let me stop. I don't really know if I'm a good freestyler. See, the thing is, I'm not too used to doing it, and I feel like it
There's
takes you
only
so
one way
long
to
to like
find out,
write.
McKinley.
I know, right? It's like drop the beat, like surprise. No, it's like I kind of, I would like to think that I could do it. I make up my jokes when I'm walking around my house, but it'd probably be more like a Bo Burnham situation than an actual like rapping situation. You know, there's merit in that, but I don't know.
You think it's going to be more like stand up than?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it's easy to rhyme words with like fart or something, but if I'm trying to say something, I don't know if I could actually be like any of those lyrics to you organically right now, you know?
I think it's exciting, and I think there's a ton of opportunity. We talked about some of the earlier hip hop jazz stuff that was coming out in the '90s, and like to the best of my knowledge, a lot of it was really just like, oh yeah, let's like sample, let's
Definitely.
sample Herbie Hancock or something,
Definitely.
versus like let's play with a live band. And this opens up kind of a potential whole new world when it comes to live music and recording in the studio.
Definitely, definitely. And I think it has given me sort of a language that a lot of other rappers don't really have because of access. I think being able to work with this band on and off record has allowed me to know how people communicate and has allowed me patience when communicating with people. So I definitely hope it opens up a new avenue of vulnerability for how rappers approach music.
There was no touring last year, and obviously there's no touring for most of this year. What does that mean for somebody who not only has an album coming out, but somebody who, when he does tour, will be touring with a band?
I think that my album kind of lasts the test of time. I think I'm confident in that. And that also comes from me sitting with it for so long that even if it's several years from now when shows come out or whenever shows are happening again, people still have the same enthusiasm with trying to hear these songs live, transposed live.
There's no specific tour plan right now.
No, not really. I should probably think about that soon. I mean, shows are coming. It's like so weird because like shows are coming back, and the worst thing about shows coming back is that so many big names are like locking venues down. Even if they don't happen, they still have that venue locked, and it's like honestly, the majority of venues are locked down until January, February, which is so weird to think because we don't know when music's actually coming back, but also you can't really bring it back if you wanted to if you don't have that sort of support. So I'm kind of in that weird middle spot where it's like I think I'll do pretty well when shows come back, but for right now I have no idea what's going on and I'm okay with that.
It sounded like there's a little bit of sort of not necessarily social anxiety, but sort of like anxiety around kind of getting out there and doing the tour thing again. I mean, at this point, is there more anxiety around it, or is it more just sort of like excitement around the opportunity of when you do have a chance to do that?
Excitement. I'm so excited to be rapping again on stage. I'm so excited to be in a different city, just in a different, just waking up, being like, oh, I'm still in the same state. Wild. Going back to sleep. I love touring. I think that I didn't take it for granted, but I definitely would appreciate it more, even those the worst shows now.
Is there a scene in Richmond?
Yeah, it's cool. So Richmond was very punk at one point. I can't remember. I want to say Lamb of God came out of it. Guar came out of it. Other bands of that sort of like nature were really big back in the day. And as the 2000s hit, it took a little bit for the rap community to get there, but it sort of really picked up around the 2000 like 15 or so when me and a couple other people kind of came onto the scene and this group called Mutant Academy kind of came onto the scene and there's Obliv, which is like who is a producer who's been here for a long time, DJ Harrison, who's the drummer from Butcher Brown, who's like been in the scene for a long time. And there's also a lot of current upstarts like Lucy Dacus is out there doing a lot of really wild things just constantly. So it's a cool community that I mean, Natalie Prass lived here for a little bit. Like that group of people comes through a lot. So I definitely think it's a good place to have access to a bunch of other places very easily and sort of get your start.
You mentioned Kamasi Washington before, and like I tend to lump him in with like Thundercat in terms of
Yeah.
like these people who are or like Flying Lotus who are like kind of blurring the lines. I guess between all genres, but definitely in a lot of cases between hip hop and jazz. Do you think that as somebody who live instruments, just specifically jazz instruments and jazz instrumentation plays a role in your music, that opens up more doors? I mean, do you think the jazz community is ready for it? Do you think that do you think they're willing to kind of open themselves up to rap in ways that they maybe not necessarily haven't in the past?
I think it's very hard. I think when any genre that comes from black people has been taken and ran with in so many different directions, it sort of becomes very guarded, and it doesn't mean that it's unnecessary, but it does mean that it's sometimes harmful. So I think we'll have to see. I'm not. I'm not holding my head too much if it doesn't land for the jazz community. As much as I would love to know those cats, all of them, I think that it's working for me.